Hello, everybody, and welcome back. You're watching video 3. We've established the agenda, had our questions to start our conversation, and also did a quick little 16-minute whirlwind tour of critical race theory. All of that review was to help set up our conversation for what is known as DisCrit, which is the merging of disability studies and critical race theory. So the title slide that you see in front of you says DisCrit, Racializing Ability and Disabling Race. And I have it on the next slide, but if you remember back to week 2 of the class when I presented Talia A. Lewis's definition of ableism, it described that ableism was the root of racism and that the root of ableism is anti-Blackness. And so DisCrit is absolutely building on those notions. Basically, that there is a deep interconnection, a deep weaving between ability and race, between racism and ableism. Again, each one deserves and needs to be studied separately, independently, because there are different phenomenon. You do not want to be saying that ableism operates the same way as racism. But what DisCrit does do is understanding the influences and interconnections that happen between them. So W.E.B. Du Bois noted it widely when he recognized that intelligence and ability tests were attempts to provide scientific, biologic, empirical backing to enslavement, segregation, and discrimination towards Black and brown bodies. So again, that there's this long history of using ability statuses, bodily statuses to support enslavement, genocide, often using arguments for like voting restrictions that people's intelligence wasn't sufficient because they weren't able to fully participate in a civil society. And so the history of ableism and racism and the language are deeply interconnected. That there are segregated special classrooms, for example, have historically been populated by racial and ethnic minority groups, from immigrant populations, and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Folks of color are more likely to be categorized as having a learning disability, an intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, or a conduct or behavioral disorder. And the reality is most of the assessments that people use are rather subjective in these processes. It relies more on judgment than anything that would be simply biological fact. Disability is also a social construct that is continually shifted over time and across social context. Disability categories are not necessarily real on their own. So in the previous slides where I talked about racial differentiation, so how racial categorization shifted over historical period, disability also has shifted over our history. An example of that would be when the American Association of Mental Deficiency, what a lovely name, the AAMD, revised their definition of mental retardation in 1973 from an IQ score of 85 down to an IQ score of 70. Again, this was being driven because of the racial and ethnic disparities that were already being noticed and present inside of that label. We know the historical legacy of eugenics connected to intelligence tests, the notion of IQ, again, used to justify policies and forced sterilization. Again, so this deep interweaving of ableism and race. Okay. I just wanted to remind folks of the definition that Talia A. Lewis uses of ableism. So it's a graphic image from her blog website. And Talia writes, ableism is a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people in society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, their current state of health or wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So again, racism and ableism are normalizing processes that are interconnected and colluding with one another. They're working in tandem. In other words, racism and ableism work in ways that are often unspoken. Yet racism validates and reinforces ableist notions, and ableist notions operate and validate and reinforce racist notions. So a quote here from Ladson Billings from 2008 says, "In a racialized society where whiteness is positioned as normative, everyone is ranked and categorized in relationship to that opposition." I also have another quote here from Fiona Kumari Campbell from 2014 that reads, "An ableist imaginary tells us what a healthy body means, a normal mind, the pace and tenor of thinking, and the kinds of emotions and affect that are suitable to express." So again, ableism is telling like the proper way to speak, the proper way to walk, the proper way to hold one's body, how much eye contact you hold, and for how long. These normalizing notions of how the body is supposed to act, supposed to think like, are deeply connected to issues of racism and have been used to justify racist policies and vice versa, ableist policies. Okay. So coming up next, I have a very short video clip from Fox News on the Supreme Court nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson. So I'm going to let you listen to this 30-second clip, and then I'll come back and we'll point out the intertwining of ableism and racism that's embedded inside of it.
So it might be time for Joe Biden to let us know what Ketanji Brown Jackson's LSAT score was. What the hell did she do in the LSATs? Why wouldn't he tell us that? That would settle the question conclusively as to whether she's a once-in-a-generation legal talent. It would seem like Americans in a democracy have a right to know that and much more before giving her a lifetime appointment, but we didn't hear that.
Okay. So this little video clip brings up LSAT scores, which are a standardized test that folks take when they're getting into law school. Like the MCAT is for getting into med school. The GRE is a standardized test that you often use to get into graduate programs, and so on. And what's happening in this video is a long established history of using, of correlating, conflating, colluding racism and ableism together, that somehow blackness is associated with intellectual inferiority. We could go back through Tucker Carlson's programming. Let's not do that. But in it, there is not going to be a reference to the LSAT scores for Amy Coney, for Barrett, for Kavanaugh, or Gorsuch. Again, wheeling out these tropes and this language around LSAT scores is a very standard way in which racism and ableism are often operating together or colluding together. Okay. So here's just a little bit of background information, because I know a lot of our readings this week use the term dis/ability. So disability with a slash between the dis and the ability. And so I have the author's language up here talking about why they're using that term in that way. They talk about the slash addresses the way dis/ability is not a thing to find and fix, but it's a process. So again, the slash is sort of wanting to jar you, so to speak, pull you out of the normative way in which disability is often talked about, and talk about how it's something being constructed, that how ability and disability are cooperating together. It speaks to the ways an environment is constructed and maintained that supports or hinders access. It emphasizes a fluid process dependent upon a social context. Again, and the slash draws attention to the ways some people are deemed abled, normatively bodied, white, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, and inherently viewed as good, smart, and valuable. Again, the Dr. Subini Anama is not trying to say that there are not actual differences in disabled bodies versus bodies that would be considered non-disabled. She's not trying to say that disability or some sort of physical impairment or mental impairment doesn't actually exist. It just wants to jar us out of our standard thinking, and so that we can imagine how these processes are operating. Now, with that said, folks in the activist community and the disabled community are not a fan of using this dis/ability term. Again, because there's been an act of reclaiming words like crip, like disability, and that there's nothing inherently negative or wrong with disability. It's actually become a political identifying term, right? To identify a group, and also historically marginalized or oppressed group. And also the slash reminds people of language when people start saying, instead of handicapped, but differently abled or otherly abled. Again, sort of like pulling apart those terms and emphasizing that there's ability within disability. And also they just see this as largely an academic term, but not a term, as I alluded to, that's been largely picked up by the community, by activists. So again, I wanted to explain the term. You will see it in academic reading. You may even see it somewhat in community spaces, but for the large part, the majority, it remains largely an academic term and not a term really adopted by disabled folks. Okay. So what is DisCrit? DisCrit is an educational framework that theorizes about the ways in which race, racism, disability, ableism are built into the interaction, procedures, discourses, and institutions of education, which affect students of color with disabilities qualitatively different than white students with disabilities. DisCrit seeks to address the structural power of ableism and racism by recognizing historical, social, political, and economic interest of limiting access to educational equity to students of color with disabilities on both macro and micro levels. Micro level being like the behaviors that are actually maybe happening between the teacher and the student, to the macro being sort of social policies, cultural values that might be operating largely in the school or more largely in our society. It's looking at both the macro, the meso, and the micro ways in which this limiting of access occurs. So the problems being tackled by DisCrit is, again, that disabled students of color tend to be educated in settings segregated from the general population more than their disabled white peers, even when they have the same disability label. This would be an example of what DisCrit is alluding to. Again, who's more likely to gain access to general education classroom settings, higher expectations for performance, who's being segregated and having their bodies segregated and having a different educational experience. Black students are 67% more likely to be removed from schools on the grounds that they're being labeled or deemed dangerous in comparison to white students. That's a finding from a study by Myers in 2007. Same study, Black students are 13 times more likely to be arrested at school in comparison to white students. And also that we see females of color overrepresented in disciplinary actions, special education, and the juvenile legal system compared to their white female peers. So another way of understanding DisCrit is that it problematizes the binary that exists between normal and abnormal, abled and disabled, and how that plays out in a range of contexts. So for example, it's wanting to study the physical layout of K through 12 schools with special education spaces are often segregated into like its own separate hallway. Sometimes it could be in its own separate building. So again, understanding how there are these bifurcations and even in the physical design of the building, from hallways to buildings. And then there's symbolic and material ways that disability occupies more segregated or quarantined spaces. Departments of special education are often detached from the curriculum and instruction of general education that happens in schools. And also in scholarly literature, so if you're following like the journals and reading the latest research that's coming out, for example, if you study special education and are writing about disabled students, you're going to have a much more difficult time getting that research published in general education journal. Again, the journal is going to want a justification, a rationale for why that a general education teaching audience would be interested in your study that has a primary sample of disabled students. Again, segregation of scholarly ideas, of physical bodies, of different curriculums, different levels of expectation. So DisCrit helps us question how these segregating lines are being drawn inside of schools, how it's maybe these lines have shifted or changed over time based on the type of disability, who in the school has control over setting curriculum, over creating these segregated spaces of deciding why this body should be removed from a general education space for this class session and moved to a special education class space. Like, who's deciding on that? And again, what impacts does this segregating line produce in educational and societal outcomes for disabled students? So again, DisCrit is attempting to do all these things. When you see this thing here on the screen about problematizing binaries, you can see again that it's being informed by other critical theories like queer theory, right? Because queer theory is always about, why do these lines exist? Who's privileged and excluded based on that binary or that definition? So DisCrit is picking up on the same kind of critical analysis, right? So let's look at the 7 major tenets of DisCrit. So the first major tenet focuses on the way that the forces of racism and ableism circulate interdependently, often neutralized and invisible ways to uphold notions of normalcy. This really connects to those major ideas when we reviewed critical race theory, that race often operates, particularly for the privileged group, often invisibly, that the privilege is embedded in that. And so again, when you hold up this idea of what is normal, who gets to exist inside that normalized category, that normal space, their privileges and the structures that enable their life and their successes are really never examined, labeled, or named. But people who are disabled or excluded from that normal category, well, they're hyper labeled, hyper focused on, they're hyper studied. So like if you remember back to a week or two ago where we talked about that ad that was talking about compulsory able-bodiedness and how it really described the disabled body and where that disabled body was located. But the able-bodiedness was sort of left behind it, standing behind that definition. It was like whatever is the opposite of this disabled space is what able-bodiedness is. And so here they're really talking about the interdependent nature of racism and ableism and how they're working together to uphold what would be normal based on able-bodiedness and whiteness. So second major tenet of DisCrit is that it's strongly positioning an intersectional analysis, that to understand how the school to prison nexus is operating, for example, you cannot understand that phenomenon without explicitly having theory, data collection, practice that's intersectional in design, that it needs to have this explicit multidimensional identity format to really understand how things are operating. And it would challenge and call into question if anyone is looking and saying, well, this is just a race intervention, or this is just a disability intervention. Well, how is it operating differently across those intersections? So again, it considers how certain identity markers that have been viewed as differences from cultural normal standards, have allowed teachers, other school personnel, and society to perceive particular students at those intersections as deficient, lacking, and inferior. The third major tenet emphasizes the social constructions of race and ability, and yet recognizes the material and psychological impacts of being labeled as racist or disabled, which sets one outside of the Western cultural norms. So the third tenet rejects the understanding of both race and disability as primarily biological facts, and recognizes that the social construction of both as a societal response to it as a difference from that able-bodied white norm. Again, that's not to say that social constructions don't have a real-world material, psychological impact. They absolutely do. I think it's so important to remember that and hold it that way. Segregation, particularly of Black and brown students labeled with a disability, could be illegal if it was based on race, but is sometimes allowed because disability is seen as biologic and real rather than a constructed difference. So if you were bringing an intersectional analysis here and you knew that race was actually driving more than disability, the reason why these students are being segregated, it would be illegal and not allowed. But when you get to focus on the disability, where people are much more comfortable buying into a medical model of understanding, right? Thinking of it in terms of biologic difference and not social construction, well, then it's legally okay in which to create these segregated experiences, these segregated spaces. But as we've got through some of the data, we know that Black and brown students, disabled students, are way more likely to experience disciplinary actions, different kinds of labels. And those labels, which are socially constructed, often deemed biologic, are having a real world impact, right, on education. And also, as we're going to get to later in this lecture, pulling people into that school to prison nexus. The fourth tenet reads, it privileges voices of marginalized populations, traditionally not acknowledged within research. So I didn't highlight it in the critical race theory lecture, but one of critical race theory's major tenets as well is elevating voices of color, is that you need to provide first-person narratives, again, to provide those stories. And so DisCrit is doing exactly the same thing. Crip theory does the same thing as well, providing first-person narratives of people with disabilities. Disability justice as a movement champions privileging marginalized voices as well and centering them. So Tenet 4 is seeking to disrupt the tradition of ignoring the voices of traditionally marginalized groups, and instead privileges these insider voices. They're the folks who have this lived experience, this deep well of understanding of how inequity is operating inside a classroom or education space. Tenet 4 tells us to attend to counter narratives, encouraging us to learn how students respond to acts of injustice they experience in school, not through passive acceptance, but through tactics such as strategic maneuvering or new forms of coping and so on. Tenet 4 does not purport to give voice, and this is a really important point. Tenet 4 is not saying that we give voice to students of color. Students of color, disabled students of color already have a voice. And what we are is working in alliance with to elevate. But again, it's not about creating voice, giving voice. Again, that's sort of this hierarchical, top-down, ableistic way of speaking about it. So again, privileging those voices and removing some of the structural barriers for those voices to be heard. Okay, so tenet number 5 of DisCrit considers legal and historical aspects of disability and race, and how both have been used separately and together to deny the rights of some citizens. So again, it's understanding both the legal and the historical ways in which they get to be used separately and then combined to deny rights. So tenet 5 is looking at the root cause, essentially, of the denial of rights. It's often based in the belief of the superiority of whiteness, where in a racial hierarchy, Whiteness is often put at the center, right? The apex. Again, white acting, white forms of responsibility, white forms of speech, white forms of work. Again, and blackness is listed at the bottom of that process, with different people falling in depending on how they align with whiteness or fall outside of whiteness. Tenet 5 also really highlights the pseudo-scientific knowledge that emerged to support these policies and this denial of rights. Again, looking at the eugenic legacy, for example, and how that these pseudosciences essentially have gotten embedded in our culture, in our language, to reinforce whiteness. This disability race nexus is often built or rarefied through laws, policies, and programs, which then further drives that these concepts become the norm. We don't critically examine them. They're viewed as the natural order of how the world works. So the more things that get put into policy, get codified, get embedded in natural ways of saying things, we eventually forget that, oh, that was coming from eugenics. That term was coming out of a legacy of forced sterilization. And again, hiding covers over the race disability nexus of why it emerged in its first place. Tenet 6 reads, recognizes whiteness and ability as a property, that gains for people labeled with disabilities have largely been made as the result of interest convergence of white middle-class citizens. So here, building on interest convergence, materialist determinism, DisCrit is saying that both whiteness and ability are a property, a characteristic, that when you have it, it provides financial and psychological advantage to the people who can lay claim to whiteness and ability. And this tenet also says is that when major changes, like the Americans with Disability Act, for example, that when these major positions have changed, it's largely been through a convergence with other more powerful people. When those interests diverge over time, the folks holding on to systems of power can remove, for example, more strictly limit what a reasonable accommodation can look like, can change the definition legally of what a disability is to exclude 20, 30% of the population, make it more narrow, which is stuff that has absolutely happened in our history. The seventh and final tenet is that DisCrit requires activism and supports all forms of resistance. So it specifically acknowledges the need for us as scholars, as practitioners, as students, as faculty, everybody, acknowledges the need for activism and the reasons behind it, but recognizes that some activities traditionally thought of as activism, marches, sit-ins, other forms of civil disobedience, are often based on ableist norms, which may not be accessible for those with bodily differences. So one way of thinking about this is you hear disability justice talk about this a lot, being able to organize from one's bed, that there are a lot of ways in which we resist. There's a lot of different forms. There are a lot of different ways in which activism can look. And for folks with different bodies and the use of crip time, going back to last week's lecture, our forms of activism might look different. For someone who's autistic, might not be able to handle loud noises or large crowds. So maybe those forms of activism wouldn't be the way they would engage, but maybe they would write, maybe they would teach. So again, it's important that when we talk about activism, that we remember that it can look very differently than maybe a lot of the ways in which we've been historically taught. Tenet 7 also includes removing the policing and enforcement of normality, dissolving barriers that actively disable people, and focus on those who have experienced discrimination, allowing them to speak and talking from their lived experience. So again, centering those voices, allowing them to lead, particularly in these activist moments and spaces, the people who've lived it most directly. All right. So we've gone through the tenets, aligned it with critical race theory. But now what are some of the tensions or cautions that you should be aware of when you think about DisCrit? DisCrit contends disability must be primarily understood as a political and social category, as opposed to a biological fact that is apolitical, asocial, and ahistoric. So again, it's possible here that DisCrit is not playing to the biological reality that is true for people with, say, with chronic pain or psychiatric conditions. You could remove every barrier, every racist barrier, every ableist barrier, but you might still have chronic pain or a certain kind of disability or impairment that would still create life challenges. It can overplay those potential elements of it being primarily social construction, political, and maybe undermine some of the other lived aspects of it as well. DisCrit really talks that essentialism must be resisted. The disability is not universal for individuals with the same disability, but that cultural context, race, social class, and sexuality, etc., have an impact on it. So again, DisCrit is essentially resisting it as an essential category, which could put it at odds with different forms of community who do see it as an essential identity, that do see it as something that sort of defines their bodily experience, their body-mind experience. DisCrit recognizes that we cannot conflate race and disability, that they are not interchangeable. Yeah, and I think that's super important to hold on to that. When you do use DisCrit, one of the things that you might end up doing is that you might end up talking about how the disability experience, that ableism and racism are essentially the same. And you could identify as white, but have experienced ableism, and saying, I completely understand what it's like to experience racism. But of course, that would not be true. People who don't exist across those multiply marginalized intersecting spaces don't actually know what the lived reality of that is, don't know what the full health impact of that is. Often their privileges in those spaces are made invisible. Yes, you're experiencing ableism, but you're not seeing how whiteness, for example, might be protecting you and still opening doors, even when ableism might be smacking you in the face. DisCrit rejects any attempt to offer an account of the life and experiences of all people with disabilities without their voices. They're the ones who need to be present, the ones who need to lead. All right, so that wraps up this little video, and I will see you in the next one where we're going to get to build on these ideas and talk about the school to prison nexus. Okay, until then, see you there. Bye-bye.